And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
When Prohibition died, the Mafia didn't just survive, it cashed out. The bootleg kings of the 20s were now sitting on real money. Men who'd come off the boats with nothing but street shoes and broken English were, by the 1930s, multi-millionaires, billionaires by today's measure. They didn't just stash their cash in jewelry or gold like the uptown crowd. They built an economy inside the economy. They owned trucks, warehouses and real estate. They ran coal, oil and gas. Their hands were in the butcher shops, the fruit stands, and the docks that kept America fed. By the time the Depression hit, everything that moved, by land or sea, moved through them. The so-called captains of industry knew it. So did the politicians. When the country was starving, the mob had cash, manpower, and the muscle to make things happen. And when fascism started to rise overseas, America's elite realized something ugly but useful. Gangsters could do the dirty work that governments couldn't. The 1930s became a street fight of ideas, socialism on one side, fascism on the other. The banks had collapsed, people were sleeping in alleys, and the country was desperate for saviors. Some looked to Washington, others looked to Rome, and in that confusion, the underworld walked right into politics. At the 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the deal-making wasn't just political, it was criminal. Franklin D. Roosevelt was working the floor for the nomination. Joe Kennedy, bootlegger turned financier, was twisting arms, helping bring William Randolph Hearst and California into FDR's camp. James J. Hines, Manhattan's West Side boss, showed up with Frank Costello. Lucky Luciano was a few floors down at the Drake Hotel, with Tammany's John Marinelli still loyal to Al Smith. Meyer Lansky was floating between rooms. Everybody knew the rules. Politics made mayors, mayors made judges, judges made money. The convention turned into a carnival. Luciano took a 6-room suite with Marinelli. Costello had one with Hines. Lansky drifted between the two. Longy Zwillman handled the New York and Jersey delegates. Capone's boys, Paul Ricca, Jake Guzik, Tony Accardo, Charlie Fischetti, kept the liquor flowing. "We had the best whiskey in the world," Luciano said later. "Didn't cost us a dime." Capone's outfit supplied it all. Lansky even opened a pop-up bar where senators, newspapermen and mobsters drank side by side. Huey the Kingfish Long, the loudmouth populist from Louisiana, became one of the regulars. He wasn't there just for the whiskey. He was cutting deals. He wanted investment in Louisiana. Luciano and Costello wanted a piece of the South. One night, Long got so drunk he pissed between the legs of one of Costello's bodyguards while waiting for the men's room. The guard nearly strangled him before Costello broke it up and forced an apology. Still, the handshake that followed opened Louisiana's doors to organized crime. Luciano sent Dandy Phil Castro, an old Rothstein man with polish and brains, to run the gambling operations out of the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans. Lansky's associate Seymour Weiss oversaw the casinos. By the time Huey Long was shot dead in 1935, he'd pocketed around $3 million from the arrangement. "That's how good it was," Luciano said. "We were practically buying the guy's solid gold underwear, and for us, it was platinum. Silver dollar." Sam Carolla already had the local rackets. Costello came in to expand and immediately saw a problem. The numbers from New Orleans didn't add up. Somebody was skimming. He flew in from New York, dragging men out of bed, demanding answers. If someone lied, Costello solved it quick. One punch, lights out, warning delivered. The bleeding stopped when he met a young hustler named Carlos Marcello. Marcello understood the streets, the politics, and the angles. Costello shipped him 250 slot machines to test. Marcello turned them into the profit of 1,000. Every penny was accounted for, and every surplus dollar went north. No leaks, no games. Trust was born. Over the next 3 decades, Costello became the architect, and Marcello his southern counterpart. By the 1960s, Marcello owned Louisiana outright. Costello later called it his smartest investment. The truth was simpler. His smartest investment was Carlos. Dandy Phil Castro remained the middleman. With Mill's novelty out of Chicago, Costello built a legitimate slot business, true mint machines that paid candy and slugs redeemable for cash. By 1931, there were over 5,000 of them in New York alone. Kids needed ladders to reach the levers. When Fiorello LaGuardia took City Hall, he made war on them. On the East River, reporters watched the mayor swing a sledgehammer through crates of seized machines. "That makes it more fun," he said. In Albany, they changed the penal code to make slot seizures legal. Costello lost his injunction and his northern roots. So he moved the action south, to Huey Long and Silver Dollar Sam. The legend said Long got jammed on a trip to New York, and Costello helped clean it up. Costello called the move business, even charity. Whatever the truth, the partnership was real. He sent 1,000 machines to New Orleans under Long's protection, splitting profits with Carolla. New York and New Orleans watched each other's backs. The Louisiana mob was no longer a backwater outfit. It was part of the national network. They built communications hubs, ran money through banks, and cleaned it through casinos. The South was officially open for business. Meanwhile, something bigger was happening behind the docks. Sam Zemurray, Sam the Banana Man, was taking over the United Fruit Company. He controlled the trade from Louisiana to Boston, tied in with Silver Dollar Sam's men, and worked quietly with Lansky and Mike Miranda. With the ports and ships in his pocket, fruit wasn't the only thing moving. Guns, cash, and contraband could pass unnoticed. Zemurray's people worked hand in hand with Washington fixers who learned to topple foreign governments in the name of protecting trade. The Navy provided the muscle. The CIA would later provide the blueprint. By the time Allen Dulles came on the scene, the same hands that handled bananas were handling coups. Through it all, Costello stayed close to the action. United Fruit needed clean docks and quiet labor. The mob provided both. The deals ran from New Orleans to Boston, straight through the Depression. When politicians needed campaign cash, Costello had it. When business needed muscle, he sent it. When the government needed plausible deniability, they found it in men like him. By the mid-1940s, Frank Costello was untouchable. Even J. Edgar Hoover, the nation's top cop, was rumored to take quiet walks with him in Central Park. Time magazine hinted at secret meetings. Ex-FBI men swore it was true. Hoover's official line was that organized crime didn't exist, while his friends in New Orleans and New York were making sure it did. Costello's empire was built on three things: politics, ports, and people who knew how to keep their mouths shut. From a nickel slot in a candy shop to state houses and boardrooms, he'd made the system work for him. The bosses had come to America with nothing, and by the 1930s, they owned the street, the docks, and the future. Back at the convention, the air inside Chicago's stadium was thick with sweat, smoke, and deals. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, and their allies waited until the last minute to make their move. They'd been playing it cool, keeping both sides guessing, while their fixers worked the corridors. When the moment came, they made their offer. The meeting was quiet, private, backroom politics at its dirtiest. Around the table sat the real power: James Curley from Boston, Tom Pendergast from Kansas City, Huey Long from Louisiana, and a handful of other ward bosses who owned the vote counts. The mob's price was simple. If Franklin Roosevelt agreed to kill off Judge Samuel Seabury's investigation into Tammany Hall and its gambling ties, they'd deliver him the delegates. When Frank got the word Roosevelt would taper off Seabury so he could save face, Luciano said later, it was in the bag. There was one last thing to do: cut loose Al Smith. Luciano respected Smith. The man had been a fighter, and he'd given a lot of immigrants their first taste of political dignity. Luciano went to see him himself. I told him we figured Roosevelt was going to win and there was no way to stop him, he said. That meant we had no chance but to throw in with Roosevelt. Smith asked me straight out what the deal was. I told him Roosevelt promised to close his eyes to Seabury and keep them closed. You saw what happened last spring when he made that statement. We got to believe him after that. Smith didn't argue. He just stared at Luciano for a long moment and said quietly, Charlie, Franklin Roosevelt will break his word to you. This is the biggest mistake you ever made in your life, trusting him. He will kill you. Luciano walked out shaking. His gut told him Smith was right. But the trap had already been sprung. The Seabury investigation had been chewing at Luciano and Costello for months, ripping open their political protection in New York. Seabury's people were dragging judges, cops, and politicians into hearings, pulling apart the web that kept the rackets safe. Every day, Luciano opened the paper and saw another headline screaming about graft, vice, or Tammany payoffs. He and Costello were boxed in. The only leverage they had left was the 1932 Democratic Convention. And Roosevelt was the only man who could make Seabury back off. The irony was that Roosevelt had been playing his own game all along. The patrician smile, the cigarette holder, the voice that promised a New Deal. Behind it was a man who understood power better than any street boss. When Costello's men first met FDR's representatives, Roosevelt sent a signal. He said Seabury's work had done some good, but failed to uncover any true organized crime network. To Costello, that sounded like a deal. But it wasn't. It was bait. Roosevelt let Seabury keep digging, using the judge as both a political weapon and a bargaining chip. By the time Luciano and Costello showed up in Chicago, they were walking into a negotiation where Roosevelt already held all the cards. Al Smith saw it. He'd been one of them once, the old-school reformer who rose through Tammany's ranks, but FDR had outplayed him too. Smith's warning wasn't personal. It was prophecy. Once Roosevelt got the nomination, the smiles vanished. Seabury was given full rein. The investigation went into overdrive, and the mob's political empire began to collapse. FDR used public outrage against organized crime as a campaign weapon, painting himself as the reformer who would clean up America. The same men who helped put him in the White House were now his first targets. Schultz, Capone, Lepke, Luciano. They'd become too rich, too visible, too easy to hate. It was a clean double cross. "Roosevelt was a prick all along," Luciano admitted later, "but I got to give him credit. He was smooth. And looking back, he did exactly what I would have done. What I did was illegal. I broke the law. What he did was legal. But the pattern was the same. We were both shit-ass double-crossers, no matter how you look at it. Now, I don't say we elected Roosevelt, but we gave him a pretty good push." For Luciano and Costello, the message was clear. Politicians could never be trusted. They'd spent a decade buying judges and cops, greasing the system, building empires. Now the government had learned their playbook and turned it against them. The mob had built the machine. Roosevelt simply learned how to drive it. Within 4 years, the reckoning came. By 1936, Luciano was in prison. Costello, older and wiser, retreated to New Orleans, rebuilding quietly with Marcello and Silver Dollar Sam. The handshake politics of the old days were gone. Everything from now on would run through lawyers, unions, and legitimate fronts. "I always knew politicians were crooked," Luciano said later. "You could buy them any time you wanted, and you couldn't trust them around the corner. But I never knew their word was no better than a lot of racket guys. I guess nobody should become President of the United States on the back of a gangster." The underworld had helped put Roosevelt in office, and Roosevelt had taught the underworld a lesson it would never forget. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the White House, America was split down the middle. The country was broke, bitter, and searching for identity. Isolationism, nationalism, even socialism, they all had their followers. But Roosevelt promised something bigger: stability. He dragged the country out of the Great Depression, rebuilt its confidence, and gave it a name: the New Deal. In the process, he became the most powerful president in American history. But the New Deal had enemies, and some of them weren't in Congress. They were in the underworld. Under FDR, the Justice Department went to war with organized crime. Names that had dominated headlines through Prohibition started falling one by one. Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz, Lepke Buchhalter, Abe Reles. The list read like a roll call of the Mafia's founding fathers. Politicians, judges, and cops who'd been on the take suddenly found themselves under indictment or in the ground. Even Chicago wasn't immune. Al Capone was already in prison for tax evasion, but that didn't save his crew. Paul Ricca and the old Capone hands were dragged into court. Tony Accardo, Joe Batters, took control of the outfit. Roosevelt's Justice Department seemed untouchable, but there was one place he wouldn't touch: the South. He needed it to win, and he knew it. The Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, were the kingmakers. So he promised to leave them alone. To prove it, he picked John Nance Cactus Jack Garner of Texas as his running mate. It was a message: the South was safe. Behind the scenes, the alliance ran deeper. FDR was an aristocrat from a long line of wealth and quiet power. His circle overlapped with America's oldest secret orders, the Freemasons chief among them. Garner was one of them too, a 33rd degree Mason. The connection wasn't new. Freemasonry had been woven into the fabric of American politics since the founding days. But in Roosevelt's time, it had matured into something more: a shadow network of businessmen, politicians, and financiers who shared lodges, handshakes, and influence. In Britain, the Freemasons were spoken of openly, part corruption, part tradition. In America, the conversation never happened, but their reach was the same. Judges, cops, military officers, all sworn to secrecy under the same symbol. To critics, they were the invisible elite, quietly steering power, laundering influence through philanthropy, and shielding their own. Some of their number leaned toward fascism, not because they loved Hitler, but because they wanted to see the old European empires crumble so a new one, the American empire, could take their place. Roosevelt tried to keep them at bay. He broke monopolies, split trusts, and tore into the industrial barons who had once controlled the economy. But he knew his limits. He could move against New York and Chicago, but the southern syndicates, the ones rooted in Texas, Louisiana, and the Gulf, were off limits. He left Carlos Marcello's world alone. He didn't touch New Orleans. He never interfered with the networks running through Texas oil and southern ports. Then came Pearl Harbor, and everything changed. America went to war, and Roosevelt needed allies. To win overseas, he first had to secure the home front. The Office of Naval Intelligence was desperate to protect the New York docks from sabotage, the same waterfronts that the mob controlled. Overnight, gangsters became patriots. The Office of Strategic Services, Naval Intelligence, and even the FBI began working quietly with the underworld. Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Luciano sitting in a prison cell. Luciano was moved upstate, close to Albany, and given a deal help keep the docks running and help plan the invasion of Sicily. He delivered. The Navy got security. The Mafia got redemption. Operation Underworld was born. For the first time, America's government, intelligence agencies, and organized crime were officially on the same side. But Luciano didn't realize what he'd stepped into. There were new players now, and they weren't gangsters. They were architects of a global system. As the war turned, everyone knew Germany would lose. The real race was for what came after. The scientists were already at work on the next great weapon. Oppenheimer and his men were building something that could end the world. The atomic bomb. And everyone knew Roosevelt would never use it. That was the fear. He was too moral, too cautious, too close to Stalin. FDR saw the Soviets as partners, not enemies. But others, the Freemasons, the new Christian Zionists, the industrial elite, saw things differently. They wanted an American century and a clear enemy to build it around. For that, Roosevelt was a problem. On April 12, 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt sat for a portrait at his retreat, the Little White House. He put a hand to the back of his head and said, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Seconds later, he collapsed. The diagnosis was a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He was dead by 3:35 that afternoon. He was 63. Beside him, quietly, was Lucy Mercer Rutherford, his old mistress. Her presence stayed secret for years. That evening, Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. He was a 33rd degree Freemason. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone who paid attention. When news reached Stalin, he was stunned, then suspicious. He believed Roosevelt's death wasn't natural, that someone wanted him replaced by a man who hated the Soviet Union and would carry out the next phase of the plan. Harry Truman had come out of Kansas City from the Pendergast machine, the same machine that ran the Midwest underworld. During Prohibition, Pendergast's men, John Lazier, Charlie Binaggio, Tony Gizzo, ran liquor, gambling and rackets under city protection. Judges were bought, cops were owned, and voters were driven to the polls at gunpoint. Elections were theatre. The mob delivered the votes. The machine delivered the protection. Pendergast controlled Kansas City like a fiefdom. Every contract, every cop, every politician. It was in that world that Harry Truman was made. He'd started as a loyal foot soldier for the machine, a small-town politician whose rise depended on mob money and Masonic support. By the time Roosevelt died, Truman was the ultimate compromise candidate, clean enough for the papers, connected enough for the people who mattered. Then he did what FDR never could. He used the bomb. Twice. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Japan was already beaten, its cities firebombed, its people starving. But Truman wanted the world to see what came next. The mushroom cloud wasn't just an act of war, it was a message. A new world order had arrived. The alliance between secret power and official government was now complete. The Freemasons, the intelligence agencies, the industrialists, they built their machine. Truman and the men behind him would feed it, strengthen it, and export it. From that moment on, America would no longer just defend democracy. It would define it. And the men who came next, Eisenhower and Nixon, would make sure it stayed that way. When Harry S. Truman left office, America stood on the edge of something new, something darker. He'd been the first man to use a nuclear weapon, and the world had never been the same. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, one order, two cities erased. Truman called it a necessity. Others called it a warning. By 1949, the warning came back around. The Soviet Union had its own bomb. Overnight, Truman's power shrank. He'd built an empire of fear, but he couldn't control what came next. The Cold War was on, and Washington needed a harder face. Truman had to go. The men who decided these things, the ones behind the curtains, wanted a new horse to back. Organized crime, the intelligence community, and the corporate elite had learned to work together during the war. Now they would pick presidents the same way they picked business partners, quietly, strategically, with long odds on their side. The 1950s would be their decade. Luciano had shown them the model back in the 30s. Front companies, unions, political donations, controlled delegates. Now, those same tools were being used to shape the Oval Office. The mob was learning to play government like a racket, and the government was learning to play the mob. In Washington, fear was currency. Joseph McCarthy understood that. His Senate hearings turned paranoia into national policy. Communism was the new devil. Americans were told that socialism, atheism, and Moscow were the same disease. God was on one side, the Soviets on the other. It was the politics of panic, the same trick the government would pull again half a century later after 9/11, only with different villains and different flags. Behind the noise, another game was unfolding. For decades, J. Edgar Hoover had run the FBI like a personal kingdom, but even he never dreamed of controlling the presidency. The IRS didn't have the reach. The Office of Naval Intelligence and the OSS were too small. But the new agency born under Truman, the CIA, had both ambition and muscle. They didn't just want to protect America. They wanted to design it. The CIA understood something the others didn't. Presidents come and go, but policy lasts forever. The agency's founders, Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and Governor Thomas Dewey, were Wall Street lawyers with wartime intelligence backgrounds. They'd built fortunes off corporate power and believed America's destiny was global. The OSS had given them the blueprint during World War II. Now they wanted permanence. In 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act, creating the Central Intelligence Agency, their creation. Its mission was vague: protect America by whatever means necessary. That sentence gave them everything. By the early 1950s, the CIA was doing what Hoover never dared: grooming its own politicians. The agency's allies in Congress were fed cash, campaign workers, and secret favors. They needed young, ambitious men who could be shaped men who would remember who built their careers. One of them was Richard Nixon. Nixon had started as a low-level congressman from California, an anti-communist with no conscience and no friends. Dewey and the Dulles brothers saw something useful in him: hunger. In 1947, Nixon helped push through the vote that established the CIA. Dewey took note. The following year, When Truman tried to shut down the House Un-American Activities Committee, Dewey leaked him a gift, classified CIA material on Alger Hiss, a high-ranking State Department official accused of spying for the Soviets. The leak made Nixon a star. The Hiss case launched his career and handed McCarthy the script for the next decade of fear. 2 years later, in 1950, Nixon ran for the Senate. He painted his opponent, Helen Douglas, as the Pink Lady, soft on communism. According to CIA insiders, much of his campaign material came straight from agency files. Nixon won in a landslide. By 1952, Thomas Dewey had given up on his own White House ambitions. Instead, he threw his support behind Dwight Eisenhower, the war hero who could unite both parties, and made sure Nixon came with him as vice president. After the election, Allen Dulles took over as CIA director. His brother, John Foster, became Secretary of State. For the first time, the men who created the CIA were running the country. The agency's alliances weren't limited to Washington. They reached Havana, Marseille, and the Mediterranean underworld. The connection went back to 1942, Operation Underworld, when naval intelligence had struck a deal with the Mafia to protect the East Coast docks from Nazi saboteurs. The price was Lucky Luciano's freedom. Meyer Lansky brokered it. Luciano gave orders from his prison cell. His men patrolled the waterfront for the Navy. Governor Dewey, the same man who'd once put Luciano away, quietly approved the deal and later signed his parole. By war's end, the Mafia and the OSS were allies. When the OSS was disbanded in 1945, both sides wanted it back. Dewey, Dulles, and their Wall Street circle made sure they got it. After 1945, Lansky finished what Luciano had started. He built the International Crime Syndicate, a network bigger than US Steel. Real estate, casinos, tourism, banking. It was a corporation with its own army. From Miami to Marseille to Havana, Lansky's empire moved money and heroin under the same cover as US intelligence. When communist dock workers in France shut down the port of Marseille in 1947, the CIA called Luciano for help. Luciano sent hitters. The CIA sent cash and guns. A few murders later, the docks reopened for US shipping and for the syndicate's heroin routes. The marriage of convenience was complete. The CIA had global reach and political immunity. The Mafia had manpower and money. Together they kept the Cold War running. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Cuba, a young rebel named Fidel Castro was arming his men. He was helped early on by two Americans, Frank Sturgis and a mysterious Eduardo. Eduardo's real name was E. Howard Hunt, a longtime CIA operative and Nixon loyalist. Hunt was one of the men who convinced Washington that Castro could be controlled, a nationalist, not a communist. The agency was hedging its bets. It backed both sides, Batista and Castro, just like the Mafia had done with Roosevelt and Smith. Whoever won, Washington would own the result. But Hunt guessed wrong. Castro took Havana, declared for Moscow, and turned America's paradise into a Soviet outpost. The fallout would echo all the way to Watergate. Years later, when the burglars were caught breaking into Democratic headquarters, Nixon's first words to H.R. Haldeman were caught on tape. "The CIA will close it down. If it gets out that this is all involved, the Cuba thing, it'll blow the Bay of Pigs wide open." He wasn't lying. Watergate, the Bay of Pigs, even the collapse of governments in the Caribbean. They were all part of the same lineage, born out of that wartime alliance between the Mafia, Wall Street, and American intelligence. It started with Operation Underworld and ended with the CIA inside the Oval Office. By the time Eisenhower left Washington, the United States had become a company town. The shareholders weren't the voters. They were the men who built the company. And Richard Nixon was their favorite investment. They say America is run by presidents and senators. That's a nice story for civics class. The truth is, the men who pull the strings don't sit in Washington. They sit in boardrooms and private clubs, deciding the price of coffee, the cost of wages, and the value of the dollar in your wallet. 30 families, corporations and men, not heroes, not villains, run more of American life than the government ever will. Two of the most powerful were an immigrant fruit peddler named Sam Zemurray and a dynasty of gunpowder kings from Delaware, the DuPonts. Zemurray was no aristocrat. He was born in Bessarabia, came to New York at 11, and started with a pushcart full of bananas. By 21, he was hustling fruit off the docks in Mobile and New Orleans, speaking rough Spanish and smoother politics. He learned fast. Control the docks, you control the trade. Control the trade, you control the country that grows it. By 1910, he was rich enough to finance his own war. He bankrolled a coup in Honduras to reinstall ex-President Manuel Bonilla. In return, Bonilla handed him land, railways, and a free pass on taxes. Zemurray built the Cuyamel Fruit Company, lean, brutal, and profitable, and took the fight straight to United Fruit, the Boston-based giant that had dominated Central America for decades. By 1929, he had $12 million in the bank and a rival's blood on his hands. United Fruit bought him out for 300,000 shares, around $20 million, and forced him into retirement. But Zemurray wasn't built for leisure. When the Depression hit and United Fruit's stock tanked, he made his move. In June 1932, he walked into the boardroom with a fistful of proxies and told the men who once bought him out, "You gentlemen have been running this company into the ground long enough. I'm taking it back." By the end of the meeting, Sam Zemurray owned United Fruit. Under him, the company became a private empire. 1 million acres across Jamaica, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia. 2,000 miles of railroad. 65 ships in the Great White Fleet. Hospitals, hotels, radio stations, power plants, even a snake venom lab. 70,000 employees answered to one man, and he answered to no one. Dictators learned the hard way that crossing United Fruit meant exile, or worse. By the mid-1930s, Zemurray was one of the richest men in America. He could make a revolution in the tropics with a telegram. And when Washington wanted something done south of the border, they went through him. So when Richard Nixon rose through the ranks 20 years later, Zemurray noticed. Nixon wasn't just the CIA's man, he was corporate America's man. The Banana King and the Cold War spy masters backed the same horse. The alliance made sense. Nixon's friends, Allen Dulles at the CIA, John Foster Dulles at State, had all represented United Fruit as Wall Street lawyers. When the Eisenhower administration took power in 1953, those ties turned into policy. The Justice Department quietly shelved tax evasion cases against Meyer Lansky, ignored deportation orders, and looked the other way on organized crime's foreign investments. Everyone was making money, from Havana to Washington. Cuba was the jewel. Lansky had first gone there in 1933, when a young army sergeant named Fulgencio Batista declared himself ruler. They became friends and business partners. With Batista's blessing, Lansky built casinos and hotels, the foundation of what would become the international gambling network. When World War II came, tourism died. Lansky shuttered his Cuban operations, and Batista's grip slipped. To survive, Batista flirted with the left, promising unions and reforms. That scared Wall Street and Washington. So, in 1944, U.S. naval intelligence called on Lansky to lean on his old friend. The message was simple: hold elections, keep the communists out. Batista obeyed. A pro-American government won, and he slipped quietly into exile in Florida. While Batista regrouped, Nixon was finding his own patrons. In Washington, he fell in with George Smathers, a Miami congressman and playboy who introduced him to southern Florida's fast money crowd. Ex-FBI men, bankers, and fixers, like Charles Bebe Rebozo. They drank together, invested together, and understood each other. Money didn't have ideology. It just needed access. By the time Nixon was vice president and the Dulles brothers were running foreign policy, the same web connected United Fruit, the CIA, organized crime, and the White House. Zemurray's empire stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Andes. The CIA protected his plantations under the banner of anti-communism. The mob laundered profits through casinos and banks, and Washington called it progress. On paper, it was about stopping the spread of socialism. In reality, it was about keeping the fruit ships sailing and the money flowing. And in the boardroom at United Fruit, Sam Zemurray, the immigrant banana peddler who once bought a revolution, was smiling. Because by the 1950s, the company he built didn't just change governments, it made them. March 1952. Batista comes back from Florida like a man retrieving a coat he'd left at the bar. The coup is bloodless because it's prepaid, $250,000 of Lansky's money to the elected president to step aside. A month later, Richard Danner is walking Richard Nixon through Havana's casinos, where the chips move faster than the waiters. Under Batista, Meyer Lansky upgrades the racket, not smoky backrooms, but hotel casinos, palaces that sell glamour as a cover charge. Within a few years, the take is an estimated $100 million a year. The syndicate calls it investment. Everyone else calls it Cuba. By the mid-50s, another American power is perfecting his own version of quiet government, Howard Hughes. He's been scorched in the Senate over wartime contracting, decides the lesson isn't retreat, but insulation. He starts hiring ex-CIA hands, becomes the agency's favorite contractor, and discovers what every sophisticated operator learns. Quid pro quo is a form of national service if the paperwork is clean. Early 1956, a Hughes aide says the boss moves $100,000 to Nixon to beat a dump Nixon push. December 1956, Hughes loans $205,000 to Donald Nixon for a hamburger stand that never pays back. Soon after, a Justice Department antitrust case melts into a consent decree, and the Hughes Medical Foundation gets the long-denied tax exemption, worth about $30 million a year. For the next decade, Hughes's interests braid into Nixon, the CIA, and, through the money, the syndicate. January 1st, 1959. A bearded lawyer from the Sierra Maestra takes Havana. Castro wins. Batista and Lansky leave the island the same day. Back in Langley, the CIA starts planning the return. Officially, it's about communism and national security. Unofficially, it's also about lost casinos, lost routes, lost leverage. Lansky had engineered a skim that washed untaxed money through Felton ledgers. The agency, according to its own people, used the same plumbing to move cash to the underworld assets it outsourced. The plan is simple on paper and lethal in execution. About 1,200 Cuban exiles hit a beach, push inland, proclaim a government. The proclamation becomes the pretext for U.S. military cover. E. Howard Hunt recruits the exiles and later says Nixon is the White House secret action officer. As the invasion nears, a side-op takes shape. Kill Castro to break morale. The CIA taps Robert Maheu. Maheu hires Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante. The budget is $150,000. President Johnson will later spit the truth. We're operating a damn murder incorporated in the Caribbean. None of the hits land. The disaster that does is the Bay of Pigs. But that wasn't the first time Washington overthrew a government for business. The dry run was Guatemala, 1954, a coup built for United Fruit and blessed by the Cold War. United Fruit isn't a company. It's a sovereign. Nearly half of Guatemala's farmland, the railroads, Puerto Barrios, the telecom lines, all theirs. Workers live in company towns and get paid in company scrip. That's not a metaphor. It's a monetary policy. The phrase banana republic starts here because UFCO is the state behind the state. Jacobo Arbenz, elected 1951, isn't a communist. He's a New Deal nationalist. He wants land reform, independence, a country that belongs to the people who live on it. Decree 900, 1952, takes idle acreage and redistributes it to peasants. United Fruit loses about 225,000 acres of unused land. The government offers compensation at UFCO's tax valuation, not the fantasy number the company quotes to Wall Street. Boston screams, Washington listens. The connections are brazened. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, once United Fruit's lawyer. Alan Dulles, CIA director, sat on UFCO's board. Tommy the Corcoran lobbies. Edward Bernays, father of modern PR, labels Arbenz a Soviet catspaw and feeds the line to editors already primed to see red. Operation PBSUCCESS goes live. The CIA builds a fake radio station, the voice of liberation, to invent victories and forecast doom. UFCO and the agency flood papers with reports of communist infiltration. The US blocks arms to Guatemala. Arbenz buys from Czechoslovakia, which then becomes the proof everyone wanted. Exiles train in Honduras and Nicaragua. June 18th, 1954. Castillo Armas crosses the border with a small force backed by big propaganda. The Guatemalan officer corps cracks under the pressure. June 27th. Arbenz resigns and leaves the country. The coup works because fear works. Fast forward. 1960. Nixon loses to Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs plan is dropped on JFK's desk as a fait accompli. April 17th, 1961. The exiles hit the beach and are cut to pieces. The CIA wants Air Force cover. Kennedy refuses. The agency never forgives him. October 1962, the missile crisis. The CIA reads it as prelude to Invasion 2 and activates Bay of Pigs survivors. Kennedy cuts a deal. Missiles out, war off, covert ops wound down. He starts talking about a rapprochement with Havana. Inside the White House, he says it out loud. The CIA will have to be dealt with. Mid-November 1963, he orders aides to prepare a full house cleaning. November 22nd, while JFK rides through Dallas, his private emissary opens talks with Castro in Havana. That same day, according to the Church Committee, the CIA greenlights another Castro hit in defiance of policy. By sundown in Dallas, the plan dies with the man. The Warren Commission blames it on Lee Harvey Oswald, lone gunman. Leon Jaworski, later Mr. Watergate, is special counsel. Oswald's file is a riddle. Marine with top clearance at a CIA-linked U-2 base in Japan, then a sudden defection to the USSR on a $1,500 fare with $203 in the bank. The Soviets think he's a plant. After 2 years, he's welcomed home, citizenship papers restored. Summer 1963. Oswald turns up in New Orleans running a one-man pro-Castro group, handing out leaflets stamped with the address of a building used by the CIA's Anti-Castro Cuban Revolutionary Council, a Front E. Howard Hunt helped set up. Oswald is seen with David Ferry, a pilot who worked Bay of Pigs training for the CIA, and, when the day job ends, serves as a pilot and investigator for Carlos Marcello. Late that summer, Ferry calls a Chicago number tied to a young woman who arrives in Dallas the day before the assassination, with a man who meets twice that night with Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner. After Oswald is arrested, Ferry drives 1,000 miles to a Houston ice rink, hogs a payphone for frantic calls, and vanishes back into the storm. Hours later, Ruby walks into police headquarters and kills Oswald. Jim Garrison names Ferry a conspirator in 1967. 4 days later, Ferry is found dead of a brain hemorrhage. The same day, his friend Eladio Del Valle is found shot and hacked to death. Garrison says Ferry was about to flip. Without him, the case caves in. As for Ruby, at 15 he's running errands for Frank Nitti in Chicago. Later, he's a fixer in the Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union, where the president ends up murdered. Robert Kennedy will call that killing a key step in the syndicate's takeover of the union. Ruby lands in Dallas in 1947. A Chicago emissary says a Kefauver lawyer. He visits Louis McWillie, a Lansky casino man, in Cuba, 1958, and Vegas, October 1963, and phones Paul Dorfman, Irwin Weiner, Barney Baker, names deep in the Chicago book. 3 months after Dallas, the CIA meets again to plan a second Cuba invasion. Hunt, wearing the mask of a retired official, is put in charge. A hitman goes in to clear the way. He's caught. The plan collapses. And that's the pattern. Batista by bribe. Arbenz by radio. Castro by exile, army and murder plots. Kennedy by a story that never stops changing. The boardrooms choose, the company executes, the syndicate collects. The flags and names update with the decade. The method doesn't. Because once you build a machine that overthrows governments for profit, you don't retire it. You rebrand it. In 1932, when Luciano, Costello, Lansky and their circle were holding court in Chicago, people swore they were kings. They weren't. They were playing checkers in a room where the real power, politicians, patricians, spy masters, corporate money, was playing chess. It took decades for that lesson to sink in. The next generation learned it the hard way. Russell Bufalino, Carlo Gambino, Santo Trafficante, Tony Provenzano, Tommy Lucchese, Vito Genovese, Joe Profaci, the Dallas crowd, and a handful of sharp Jewish operators like Harry Stromberg. They understood what a Kennedy Justice Department could do, because they'd seen what their own arrogance had already done to them. The underworld's resume by the mid-50s was radioactive. Murdered journalists, politicians, cops, witnesses, jurors. Anastasia shot in a barber chair. Costello grazed in his own lobby. Frank Scalise dead in a market. Luciano's empire exposed, then exiled. European and American intelligence services were swapping notes. All it would take was one administration, one attorney general, smart and relentless enough to connect the dots and declare total war. The facade would crack. They knew it. And still, in 1957, 3 weeks after Anastasia went down, the bosses called a sit-down. Apalachin was supposed to be a coronation. Vito Genovese, with Gambino, Trafficante, Bufalino, and dozens of others, resetting the board. Carlos Marcello didn't show. Not out of disrespect. He couldn't leave Louisiana without alerting immigration, thanks to the 1952 law that tethered him to the state. Everyone else came. 60+ of the most powerful men in American organized crime. They brought cash, aliases, and a single cover story, visiting a sick friend. The trouble with coronations is they attract witnesses. This one had a cop. A year later, in January 1958, state narcotics agent John Cusack ripped open an older wound before a legislative committee. The murder of Carlo Tresca. He named the chain. The order likely came from Frank Garofalo, a Profaci ally. The trigger was Carmine Galante, Bonanno's enforcer. The man who made it happen was Joe Bonanno himself. The motive stacked like cards. Genovese, riding out the war in Italy, was currying favor with Mussolini and rebuilding his rackets. Il Duce wanted Tresca dead for politics. Genovese wanted him gone for business. Bonanno took the job to gain with both. Galante pulled the trigger. The blowback was immediate activists in the streets, papers, howling, the heat landing right on the rackets. Luciano, then trying to buy daylight by helping naval intelligence on Sicily, couldn't afford a journalist's assassination on the front page. He never forgave Bonanno, Galante, or Genovese. Cusack didn't stop with Tresca. He said Apalachin's agenda was heavy with dope. He named 3 top traffickers present: Nick Civello, Kansas City; Big John Ormento, Long Island; Dominic D'Agostino, Niagara Falls, and laid down the continuity. Secret summits weren't new. December 1926, Bonanno, Profaci, Magliocco picked up at a Cleveland hotel. 1952, Genovese and Vincent Rao quietly meet in the Florida Keys. 1953-54, bosses gather in Chicago. October 1956, a warm-up right near Apalachin, a Binghamton soft drink salesman's convention hosted by Joseph Barbara, the same man holding court a year later. That night in 56, Galante is stopped and fined $150, 30 days. A New Jersey official floats a $1,000 bribe at the trooper, Edgar Croswell, the man who will wreck Apalachin. Galante offers a driver's license that isn't his, Joseph Di Palermo's suspected Tresca getaway wheel. Both men disappear into air. By 57, Bonanno's circle is braided into narcotics. Cusack calls Ormento one of the most active traffickers in the country. He tags Magliocco as a long-time high-ranking mafioso tied to dope men. He places Bonanno close to the center, meeting in Italy with an associate of the exiled Luciano before Apalachin. Word was Luciano and Joe Adonis, both abroad, sent instructions to the summit through Frank Cucchiara of Boston and Phil Brucola of Massachusetts. The fallout is immediate. Governor Averell Harriman calls Apalachin strange. Tioga County impanels a special grand jury. Russell Bufalino takes the fifth 26 times. Investigators reopen the 1956 bribe probe tied to Galante's stop. Everywhere they turn, Bonanno's name floats. Never loud, never central on paper. Always there. The public story, what made the papers, sounds almost polite. November 15th, 1957. A stone house on a hill outside Apalachin, New York. Host, Joseph Barbara, bottling works owner. Price tag on the property, a clean $100,000. The official line from the men there, just visiting a sick friend. That's what each told the state police. Troopers, helped by U.S. Treasury agents, ring the hill. They copy plates from out-of-state Cadillacs in a region where November doesn't bring tourists. When the pens come out, the convention breaks for the woods. 13 are pulled from a field. Others are caught at roadblocks. No guns. Lots of cash. Minimum $450 in each pocket. One man with $10,000. Their occupations read like a parody. Distributors, butchers, taxi men, restaurateurs. The New York World Telegram and Sun floats the obvious agenda. Split Albert Anastasia's stock. Coin machines, vending, garbage hauling. Reassign his pieces among other powerful gang chieftains. Sergeant Edgar Croswell, the same trooper who had pinched Galante in 56, runs the show. He calls it what it is, a good cross-section of the nation's hoodlums. The roster reads like a yearbook of the Commission: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Labor Relations, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Magliocco, Michelle Mike Miranda, Vincent Rao, Russell Bufalino, Drapery Man, Paul Castellano, Butcher, John Scalish, Cleveland, Joseph Civello, Dallas, Frank DeSimone, Los Angeles, Natali Evola, Frank Maggiore, James Ostico, Mike Genovese, Pittsburgh, Gabriel Kelly, Manarino, Armand Rava, Joseph Ricobono, Frank Zito, Springfield, Illinois, Simone Scozzari, San Gabriel, by way of Palermo, Luis Santo, Santo Traficante Jr., San Souci, man from Havana, Frank Cucchiara, Boston, Costense and Frank Valenti, Rochester, Joseph Ida, Jersey, James Coletti, Colorado, John DeMarco, Shaker Heights, Angelo Ciandra, Pittston, Patsy Ciortino, Auburn. Rosario Mancuso, Utica. Sam and Patsy Monachino, Auburn. Salvatore Tornabe, Joseph Falcone, Dominic Olivetto, Joseph Rosato, Anthony Riella, Bartolo Guccia, Ignatius Canoni, Anthony Guy, Guaricri, Emmanuel Ziccardi, Joseph Barbara Jr., plus the Western New Yorkers the next day's wires highlight: Sam Lagatuta, James V. LaDuca, John Montana, Roy Carlisi, Antonio Magadino, Dominic D'Agostino. State police say 9 more names never made it to the ledger. Lackeys, drivers, locals. Reporters printed the quotes. John Montana, taxi magnate, swore he'd just quickly visited while fixing car trouble. Didn't know a soul, not even Genovese, and the troopers were wonderful. Barbara said he'd had heart attacks, his doctor forbade long conversations, and yes, it was good to see my friends. Croswell shrugged. No charges, no statute for being a mob boss. But the message was delivered. Get out. For years, people have insisted it was a snitch that burned the meeting. It wasn't Luciano tipping from Italy or Costello from a cell. In the 1950s, television and the Kefauver hearings had already put faces to the word gangster. The rot in local law enforcement ran deep. FBI field bosses and even J. Edgar Hoover weren't immune. But power always has seams. Evil wins when good men do nothing. That day, a good man did something. He saw the cars, made the calls, threw the net. Edgar Croswell exposed the architecture, proved in broad daylight that a national organization existed and could summon 60-plus businessmen from New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Illinois, California, Texas, Colorado, Florida, Cuba, and Puerto Rico for a steak barbecue and a vote. The shockwaves hit everywhere. Frank Costello was already fighting taxes and doing time. Luciano was in Sicily. The day he heard he was finally eating easy, his stomach behaved for once, when an associate rushed into the restaurant with the news. Luciano went home, vomited, and sank to the floor. The system he'd designed to be invisible meet only on home turf in places absolutely controlled. Atlantic City under Nucky Johnson, Chicago under Capone and Tony Accardo, Chicago again when they moved votes for Roosevelt, Havana in '46, a country they practically owned, had been violated. Another rule, no big meetings after big hits, was ignored. Genovese called Apalachin 3 weeks after Anastasia's murder. Men arrived half expecting to be killed. Some checked with Luciano. He told them the truth. He hadn't sanctioned it. The mechanics, Bufalino, Joe Barbara and others, set the table anyway. The troopers flipped the table over. Then came the Senate shows, the committees, the names on television. Jack Kennedy and Robert Kennedy stepped into the lights, Jack campaigning for the White House within 3 years, Robert soon to be Attorney General. Luciano wanted Genovese erased, but knew the price, him or his family. He was aging, isolated, watching a board he no longer controlled. The old guard was dead or deported. The new power, Gambino, Accardo, Giancana, Trafficante, men not about to be shipped out, ruled. The lesson was brutal and simple. Deportation equals irrelevance. Joe Adonis learned it. Everyone learned it. If you weren't close to America, you weren't close to power. Even so, Luciano still commanded respect in Sicily. Gambino, who wanted New York and had family roots in Palermo, kept the line open. The message back from the old maestro was crisp. Frame Vito Genovese on narcotics. Punish Vincent the Chin Gigante for the Costello hit. Box Carmine Galante to weaken Bonanno. 2 fronts followed. One against Washington, the worst strategic error the mob would make, backing the Kennedys and then trying to manage the blowback. The other against Genovese, which would, step by step, roll toward Joe Valachi's microphone. The first attempt to plant Vito failed. Luciano raged. Gambino promised he'd finish the job, all three in time. Apalachin wasn't the end. It was the moment the country finally saw. The kings of checkers had wandered onto a chessboard, and the man with the badge had just called check. Joseph P. Kennedy could smell the break in the air. Apalachin had blown the cover off the industry, and 1957 handed him momentum. His boys were already circling the hearing rooms. Robert was lining up witnesses and paper, union records, immigration files, hotel ledgers, anything that showed where the money moved. The same surnames drifting toward Joseph Barbara's Hilltop Cookout in upstate New York were popping up on Teamsters rosters and AFL-CIO locals. Apalachin wasn't just a barbecue. It was a roster call. Now the Senate would read it back, line by line. The question landed like a subpoena. Why hadn't the government deported half these guys when Kiefover first put them on television in 1951? Why were Vito Genovese, Carlos Marcello, Frank Costello, and a flock of Chicago men still here, still earning 7 years later? By 58 and 59, fresh deportation orders started coming off typewriters. Old files were reopened, new names added. The pitch was simple. Close the door they'd slipped through. Joe Kennedy worked a quieter angle. He knew the language of favors. Luciano and Costello were yesterday's introductions. The future ran through Chicago. The old man didn't ask Frank Costello for anything and didn't need Lucky's blessing. He sounded out Sam Giancana and the outfit, a disciplined, cash-rich machine that treated politics like another casino. While Robert hauled witnesses into the lights, Joe probed the shadows and counted delegates. The newspapers added fuel. Miami woke up the morning after Albert Anastasia died in a New York barber chair, and tied that murder to a cold case 2 years old. Charles and Marie Ferry, 60-something transplants from Fort Lee, vanished from a blood-stained house in North Miami. No bodies, no car, no answers. Just the timing and the connections. Ferry had an $8,700 plumbing job on Anastasia's Palisades estate and a date to testify in a tax case. Other names around the same circle met bad luck too. A Fort Lee police chief due to talk about gang activity, dead by suicide in the woods. Anastasia bodyguard Vincent Macri murdered. Macri's brother Benedetto gone. A trail of blood, all that remained. One witness called it practically the same pattern every time. Anastasia as the common denominator. In Miami, people said he kept to the edges, seen outside the Carib Hotel with his brother and Midwestern racketeers spotted on Collins at Gulfstream, visible without speaking. In 52, he was told not to go back north. He went anyway. 2 years later, he's in the wind-up to the barber chair hit, and the Ferris case stays open, louder by the day. Apalachin kept echoing. On July 1st, 1958, Detroit's papers ran 30 local names as associates and contacts tied to that upstate conclave. Licavolis, Zerilis, Tocos, Bomeritos, Prizziola, Meli, and the labor men who greased the racks. The committee said it wasn't proving crimes, it was building a map. Washington, the same day, hammered federal lethargy. Senators Carl Munt and Carl Curtis said the Justice Department moved like it was stuck in molasses, while alien bosses hid in plain sight, and extortionists bored into unions. Then came the Narcotics Bureau's Martin F. Pera, under oath, linking the Grand Council in America to the exiles in Italy, and saying, flat out, that Luciano's shadow reached into the November 1957 meeting. Palermo mattered too. Joseph Bonanno, Carmine Galante, and Santa Sorge, Luciano's man overseas, seen together just before Apalachin. If Luciano couldn't travel, his instructions could. The committee rolled out a cast list and asked the obvious. What were civic leaders, union officers, and importers doing at a sick friend's steak lunch in a place nobody vacations in November? New York State Police Sergeant Edgar Croswell, who set the roadblocks and watched men scatter through wet leaves in $1,000 shoes, swore that John C. Montana of Buffalo was there. So was Russell Bufalino of Pittston, the drapery man the feds kept trying to deport. So was Joseph Profaci, the olive oil wholesaler who ran his family out of Brooklyn like he ran his parishes in Sicily. Quiet, absolute, and allergic to questions. Profaci came to the Senate and turned every question into a Fifth Amendment recitation. Counsel Robert F. Kennedy pivoted to the bloodlines. Two of Profaci's daughters married into Detroit's top tier, Anthony J. Tocco and Anthony Zerilli. The Bureau of Narcotics had been saying it for years. You don't join this thing, you're born, or you marry into it. To prove the point, the committee hung a family tree chart on the wall. Half the Apalachin delegates, connected by blood or marriage. The arrest totals stacked up under the branches: homicide, gambling, gun charges, dope, extortion. 741 tallies spread across the names. The purple gang faded. The families didn't. When reporters asked why so few Detroit faces were caught at Apalachin, staff pointed to the chart. Detroit didn't have to attend. Detroit was in the room by marriage. Robert Kennedy kept pushing. Subpoenas went to Anthony Zerilli and Jack Tocco to talk about a linen company with union ties. Detroit's jukebox wars, old rackets with new fronts, were called back into daylight. William Bufalino, who had beaten an earlier jukebox case, and Angelo Melli, a Prohibition-era organizer turned parts and music businessman, got top billing again. Old lawsuits reopened fresh questions: extortion, conspiracy, routes into vending, car washes, coin machines. Every path led to the same corner of the city, the coin box, where the quarters told the truth. The denials came, as always. In Tucson, Bill Bonanno told a reporter the mafia was a press invention, headlines selling themselves. The government and every agency with a badge said otherwise, and started reading from the same genealogy. Profaci's niece married to Bonanno's son. Detroit tied to Brooklyn. Brooklyn tied to Tucson. Cleveland and Canada stitched through Licavoli and Zerilli. Arizona as a winter office for men who liked dry heat and long memories. Even the deportation of Joe Adonis hinged on a newspaper finding that his birth address in New Jersey had been a vacant lot. Headlines weren't fantasies. Sometimes they were affidavits. By the early 60s, a police commissioner in Detroit tried something simple. Stop waiting for perfect cases and start telling the city what you know. George Edwards said the policy was exposure. Reduce the tolerance that lets the money flow. He pointed to a raid on the Gotham Hotel that knocked down gambling, then went public when his detectives found Lions players too cozy with gamblers. He tightened his command, worked the intercity phones, and put the Criminal Information Bureau on constant surveillance. Miami picked up the tale when Detroit asked. January 1963, Miami. Undercover cops watched Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, the city's gambling czar back home, sit on a $5 seat at the 5-yard line during the Lions-Steelers playoff, then lift binoculars and watch the benches. With him were Anthony Zerilli and Tony Corrado. They checked into the Diplomat under fake names, met a woman at the airport, changed hotels, slipped tails, showed up at the stadium, watched the benches instead of the field, and disappeared again. The NFL assigned 16 former FBI agents to sniff around whispers of point shaving and player contacts. Back in Miami Beach, old Detroit muscle surfaces at condos. Joe Massey, the Purple Gang alumnus, taking visitors. The paper trail didn't end in court that week, but the story kept the oxygen thin. Meanwhile, the Senate kept its foot down. The individuals at Apalachin list circulated with notes like a casting call. Dallas had Joseph Francis Civello, food and liquor importer, with a murder arrest and a Harrison Act shadow, tied to Long Island's John Ormento. California showed up through Frank DeSimone, partner once to Jack Dragner. Pueblo had James Coletti, cheese by day, records by night. Arizona threaded back through Pete Licavoli, Tucson ranches and Cleveland-Detroit gambling, plus the Tocos and Zerillis. Los Angeles offered Simone Scozzari, a cigar stand operator who happened to carry 10 grand in cash and checks when the cops stopped him. Every name looked ordinary until you laid it next to the other names. Then it was one system with regional accents. Detroit's year of hearings turned into a clinic on how labor, jukeboxes, and linen contracts could wash racket dollars. The committee dragged out the old Bilvin distributing suit against a maintenance union, then flipped it to present day. Settlements, leadership changes, the same faces in new corporations, the same homes in Grosse Pointe or south of 8 Mile. When RFK called the roll, the stories rhymed. A union office here, a vending warehouse there, a consultant with cousins in Brooklyn, and an uncle in Windsor. If you wanted to see the map, you didn't need red string. You needed a phone book and a marriage license. Back on the East Coast, the ferry file stayed open in the papers. Miami kept printing the details. The clean car in the driveway, the blood in the rooms, the missing couple. Their friend, Mrs. Viola Sheridan, also known as Doris Zinnia, vanished for a week after they did, then told anyone who asked that the mob took them and that Ferry was close to Anastasia. In the Miami underworld, Anastasia was the man you heard about but rarely saw, except on Collins with out-of-town bosses or at the track watching the board. The stories said that in '52 he'd been ordered to the beaches and told not to go back. He went back anyway, and in 1957 he paid a final bill with his life. The bigger point was never just the murders. It was the structure, and the Senate turned it into a visual aid. The family tree became a courtroom prop. Half the Apalachin guests related by blood or marriage, hundreds of arrests under one canopy, arranged marriages to Weld Brooklyn to Detroit, Detroit to Arizona, Arizona back to New York. When local cops asked why no Detroit hoodlums got caught running through the pines at Barbara's estate, the answer was clean. Detroit was there by relatives. Profasi's daughters married Tocco and Zerilli. Business moved even when bodies stayed home. By then, the old man in Hyannisport could stop rubbing his hands. The wheel was turning. Robert Kennedy's hearings linked Apalachin to labor, to narcotics, to immigration. Senators slammed justice for moving slow and asked why men flagged in '51 were still cashing checks in '59. Subpoenas reached from Brooklyn kitchens to Arizona patios. Detroit's commissioner tried publicity as a chokehold. Miami tailed gamblers with binoculars. And in the background, the outfit stayed steady, the Teamsters stayed useful, and Joe Kennedy's private conversations in Chicago stayed off the record. What Apalachin had proven in one messy afternoon, 60-odd men bolting over wet grass and into custody, was now codified in Washington. The mafia wasn't a rumor. It was a chart, a payroll, a docket, and a marriage license. The Kennedys would ride that reality into the White House. The men who built the system would try to ride it out. The names on the committee lists would say, no comment, sick friend, and Fifth Amendment. But the momentum had shifted. From the hilltop in upstate New York to a $5 seat at the Orange Bowl, the same network kept showing up. Different cities, same council, same playbook. And for the first time in a long time, the country was reading along. The Waldorf Astoria was more than a hotel. It was a fortress of luxury. White-gloved doormen, crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of power behind every door. The country was broke, people lined up for bread, and yet in the middle of the Great Depression, one man lived like Wall Street had never crashed. He signed in as Charlie Ross, but everyone who mattered knew the name. Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano turned the Waldorf into his command post. He spread $100 bills like business cards, tipping bellboys, waiters, and maids enough to buy loyalty for life. Frank Costello kept a suite there, always stocked with scotch and phone lines. Meyer Lansky stopped in when he was in town. To outsiders, it was a hotel. To the underworld, it was headquarters, a marble safe house where the nation's top racketeers shared cigars, cash, and information. Walter Winchell, the fast-talking columnist with a police scanner in his veins, took shots at them in print. He said the Waldorf had become a gangster's playground, but Winchell had his own debts. He couldn't even pay rent there. Meanwhile, Luciano left tips the size of salaries. The Waldorf was the mirror of America, the image of respectability built on an underworld foundation. And 2 decades later, a new kind of empire was rising, one not made of gangsters, but of generals, spies, and contractors. The Waldorf Astoria wasn't just a hotel, it was a stage where power dressed up for dinner. Presidents, movie stars, and gangsters all used the same elevators. When Charles "Lucky" Luciano checked in under the name Charlie Ross, nobody asked questions. The staff didn't need to. Bellboys got $100 tips just for carrying his shoes. In the middle of the Great Depression, when New Yorkers were pawning their wedding rings for rent, Luciano was handing out cash like it was confetti. Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist who doubled as J. Edgar Hoover's unofficial mouthpiece, didn't like it. He wrote that the Waldorf had become a gangster hangout. What he didn't print was that he couldn't afford to eat there himself. While Winchell scraped by, Luciano was ordering champagne and caviar to his suite. Down the hall, Frank Costello kept a permanent room. Meyer Lansky quickly visited. The place was more than a hotel. It was a neutral ground, where deals were made, truces arranged, and fortunes shifted. By the time John F. Kennedy came into office, that world of private deals and public respectability had merged into something bigger, the invisible power Eisenhower had warned about. On January 17, 1961, 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office and gave the most haunting farewell in American history. "In the councils of government," he said, "we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." He wasn't talking about a foreign threat. He was talking about America itself, the Pentagon, the arms industry, the intelligence bureaucracy, the people who never left power no matter who got elected. He told the country to stay alert, to understand that freedom wasn't only lost on battlefields, it could be signed away in contracts. A few days later, on January 19th, Eisenhower gave Kennedy the same warning face-to-face. He told him that the real levers of power weren't on Capitol Hill. They were in the military and intelligence bureaucracies. They had grown into a machine that even presidents struggled to control. "Be careful with the CIA," he said. "They'll have you by the throat if you let them." He wasn't exaggerating. Eisenhower had seen it. He'd approved covert CIA operations in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954. Both staged to protect American corporate interests like United Fruit. The missions worked on paper, but created blowback that lasted decades. By 1961, he feared that the agencies had become a state within a state. Kennedy walked into the White House young, confident, and idealistic. Within 3 months, he ran headfirst into Eisenhower's prophecy, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA had sold him a clean plan: land Cuban exiles on the beach, spark an uprising, and overthrow Fidel Castro. What Kennedy didn't know was that the plan had been built on lies and wishful thinking. The invasion collapsed within days. Kennedy took the blame, but he knew who had set him up. From that moment, the CIA became a problem to solve, not a tool to use. A few days later, Attorney General Robert Kennedy deported one of the most powerful men in the country, Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans mob boss with deep ties to Cuba, the CIA, and American politics. Marcello had been one of the quiet financiers behind anti-Castro operations. When Bobby had him thrown on a plane and dumped in Guatemala, it wasn't just an arrest, it was a declaration of war. And John Kennedy knew it. He told his aides he'd kicked a hornet's nest. That spring, in April 1961, Kennedy gave a speech that still sends chills through anyone who listens. He warned about secrecy and the creeping power of organizations that operated in the dark, what he called the enemy within. He was speaking about communism, yes, but also about something closer to home: secret societies, organized crime, intelligence agencies, and the corporate machinery that fed them all. He wasn't guessing. His brother had written about it already. In the late 50s, Robert Kennedy published The Enemy Within, a book about corruption in labor unions and the mob's hold on America's working class. What he described wasn't just criminal, it was systemic, a pipeline of influence that ran from the street corner to the Senate floor. By the time John was president, that system had fused with something even more dangerous: the military-industrial complex Eisenhower had warned about. Truman had built it out of fear of the Soviets. Eisenhower had expanded it to contain them. And when Kennedy took office, he inherited a monster that fed on conflict. If peace broke out, the contracts stopped. So the crises kept coming: Castro, Laos, Vietnam, Berlin, Africa. Everywhere Kennedy looked, the fingerprints of the CIA were already there. Revolutions sponsored, governments toppled, dictators groomed, and front companies in every hemisphere. If a war didn't exist, someone in Langley could invent one. Kennedy wanted to turn that around. He wanted transparency, restraint, diplomacy. He even talked privately about breaking the CIA into 1,000 pieces. But every time he tried to pull back, something exploded: Cuba, the Congo, Southeast Asia. The deeper he went, the more he realized how little of it he controlled. Eisenhower had warned him privately. The public only heard part of it. By the early 60s, America was running on two governments: the elected one and the one that ran itself. Kennedy had the seal on his desk, but the power was somewhere else: in the Pentagon's budget, in the CIA's field operations, in corporations with stakes in defense and oil and information. He was fighting them all at once: the mob, the agencies, the secret societies he had called out in his speech. He wanted to pull troops out of Vietnam, make peace with Cuba, open dialogue with Moscow. To his enemies, which wasn't peaceful, it was betrayal. When Kennedy took that stand, he was alone. The old alliances had dissolved. The gangsters he'd once tolerated through back channels now hated him. The intelligence men didn't trust him. The generals thought he was soft, and the corporations thought he was bad for business. Eisenhower had tried to warn him. The machine doesn't take orders, it gives them. And by November 1963, that warning had become prophecy. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 flew over Cuba and came home with the kind of pictures that start wars. Soviet MRBMs on pads, IRBMs in the pipeline, missiles aimed at American cities. By the morning of the 16th, Kennedy had his war cabinet in a tight room that would be known forever by a single word: EXCOMM, arguing about how many runways and launchers to bomb and how soon to send Marines ashore. The generals wanted an airstrike, maybe an invasion. Kennedy said no. He picked a naval quarantine, a blockade by another name, and took it to the country on October 22nd. Behind the cameras, he was gaming out the trade. Their missiles in Cuba, for ours in Turkey. For 6 days, the White House ran on coffee and fear, while destroyers tailed Soviet freighters in the Atlantic and Strategic Air Command went to the brink. On October 28th, after back-channel notes, a private assurance from Robert Kennedy that Jupiter missiles would quietly leave Turkey, and a public pledge not to invade Cuba, Khrushchev blinked. He pulled the missiles. Kennedy got the headlines, the partial test ban treaty the next year, a thaw in Berlin. But on Cuba, the obsession stayed. Mongoose, the big messy covert program to get rid of Castro, was declared dead and immediately reborn under new names and new bosses. That's the part most people miss. The label changed. The cast didn't. The work kept pulling from the same wells: Cuban exile groups out of Miami, organized crime brokers in Florida and Louisiana, and back-channel fixers tied into the Pennsylvania network that ran freight, unions, and favors. Those three worlds, Santo Traficante in Tampa, Miami, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Russell Bufalino up in the coalfields, were already under Robert Kennedy's lights. He was squeezing them while the CIA still needed their channels for boats, guns, and deniable muscle. Into that soup walked Lee Harvey Oswald, ex-Marine, short-lived defector to the USSR, back in the States pretending to be a one-man fair play for Cuba movement. That movement already existed with real offices in New York, and even sympathizers in London. After the Bay of Pigs, 1 million people marched overseas against US policy. Oswald saw an angle: build a pro-Castro face the public could understand and hate. Hand out leaflets. Pick a fight. Get a camera. The scuffle with Carlos Bringuier of the DRE, the anti-Castro student outfit, wasn't an accident. They'd crossed paths 3 times before the street theater that got Oswald arrested and into a radio studio. Watch the TV interview. The host unexpectedly grills him on Russia and his marriage to a Soviet wife. Oswald looks surprised the man knows the file. He shouldn't have been. The setup was a classic: anti-Castro cutouts and friendly hands inside the security world, steering him into the role of the perfect patsy. Oswald's circle didn't read like a Marxist book club. Guy Bannister in New Orleans. David Ferry, a pilot who did work for both anti-Castro camps and the wrong kind of Italians. DRE kids who liked headlines and speedboats. Files hinted at Oswald turning up at exile training grounds, the same camps retooling in case Washington greenlit a second try at the Bay of Pigs. The boys in the swamps believed they'd get Cuba back. Then they learned Kennedy was exploring back channels to Khrushchev, and even to Havana through journalists who could reach Castro's number 2. The plan on paper shifted. If Castro went down, a friendly successor would kick out Moscow, keep the revolution's land and factories in Cuban hands, and shut out the old American casino money. That killed the dream for Miami and Tampa. Even a clean hit wouldn't bring back the Riviera or the Tropicana. If you were Oswald and thought you were auditioning for history, you started to realize you were a prop. Meanwhile, inside the government, Mongoose was coming apart before the missiles were even spotted. In early October 1962, the Special Group Augmented, the interagency brain for Cuba Ops, couldn't agree on basic sabotage. William Harvey, CIA's hard man on Cuba, was catching heat from General Ed Lansdale and Robert Kennedy for not producing results. On October 16th, while EXCOMM was meeting for the first time, Robert Kennedy ducked out to rip the Mongoose crew. Richard Helms came in for Harvey and took the blast. RFK ordered daily 9:30 a.m. huddles to push sabotage. They lasted 48 hours. The missile crisis blew the calendar. Harvey didn't wait for orders. He pushed every single team and asset we could scrape together toward the island, his words later, so they'd be in position if shooting started. When RFK found out, he wanted Harvey gone. The two were oil and water. Harvey had told him flatly, "Without US troops you won't overthrow Castro, and you can't hide the fingerprints." He offered to resign. He didn't need to. The ground shifted under him anyway. On October 27th, while a U-2 was shot down over Cuba and another nearly got killed over Siberia, Kennedy wrote Khrushchev, "Lift the quarantine, guarantee Cuba's safety, and end this." The big pieces locked on November 20th. The Soviets took the Il-28 bombers out and, over Castro's objections, quietly removed tactical nukes the Americans didn't even know were there. That same week, George McManus at CIA drafted the obituary. Mongoose had been political cover more than an operational plan. The White House needed something after the Bay of Pigs. It effectively died the moment the leader-to-leader letters flew. He moved to wall CIA off from Oval Office micromanagement again. Even then, Kennedy kept his options. He wouldn't sign a formal no-invasion pledge at the UN. He wanted deniability if Cuba cracked on its own, or if the Soviets tried something in Berlin. Inside Langley, Harvey leveled with Director John McCone. Paramilitary campaigns were now unacceptable as a matter of policy. But higher authority would still demand results. The temptation, track 2, would be to throw money and guns at exile groups and pretend they could finish the job alone. They couldn't. Harvey's answer was to rewire the shop. Fold Task Force W back into the Western Hemisphere Division. Kill the cumbersome Mongoose mechanism. Let State Department babysit exile politics. Keep the capability to exploit a split inside Castro's circle. In December, the paperwork matched the pitch. Task Force W became the Special Affairs Staff, SAS. Harvey handed the keys to Desmond Fitzgerald, a polished operator who'd already learned how coups fail in Asia. At the top, Kennedy rebuilt the flowchart. Sterling Cottrell got a new Cuba coordinating committee to replace Lansdale's Mongoose circus. EXCOMM handled grand strategy. The 5,412 committee signed off on covert action. Robert Kennedy stepped back from daily mechanics. Nicholas Katzenbach took the clipboard. On January 22, 1963, Kennedy set the doctrine. Cuba was America's hostage, the way West Berlin was the Soviets. If Moscow moved in Berlin, Cuba would pay. On January 25th, he approved support for anti-Castro Cubans inside and outside, and told the Pentagon to prep plans with appropriate US combat elements. On February 25th, he told the Joint Chiefs, if an uprising breaks out, be ready to go. The exile map changed with the crisis too. On October 22nd, when Kennedy announced the quarantine, they thought the second coming was hours away. On October 28th, the trade felt like betrayal. On November 21st, lifting the blockade confirmed it. José Miró Cardona kept a low profile, then said the fight would go on. Rogelio Cisneros of Jura backed the deal publicly. Only Cubans could free Cuba, he said. The Second National Front of the Escambre cheered the end of the blockade. It meant they could raid again. The DRE, students with money, boats, and a taste for fireworks, wouldn't heal. They'd been battling their CIA handler Ross Crozier for months, ignoring orders to stick to propaganda. After an August raid, they refused help and got disarmed. One of them told a reporter the quiet part out loud. Now we have to work underground. Prices are high, and we have to deal with anybody we can, the mafia and all. He described a meeting in a Miami Beach hotel with a man who looked like a movie gangster. The DRE took checks from deep-pocket anti-communists like William Pawley and Claire Booth Luce and shopped hardware through mob brokers to build their own army. Langley tried to put a leash on them. Ted Shackley, running the CIA's Miami station, JMWAVE, told DRE boss Luis Fernandez Rocha to respect limits. No freelance hits, no press ambushes. The answer was a shrug. The DRE went over the station's head and sat down with Richard Helms in Washington on November 15th. They peddled a story about missiles hidden in caves, and then complained about Crozier. Helms warned them if US policy slid toward coexistence with Castro, They wouldn't like it. Fernandez said if that happened, they were done with CIA supervision. When another official asked for polygraphs, he said no. CIA swapped case officers anyway. On December 10th, JM Wave learned Crozier was out. George Joannides, cover name Walter Newby, a veteran of rough politics in Greece, was in. 3 days later, Fernandez blasted an open letter to Kennedy. If Washington made peace, the DRE would keep fighting by every means possible. The Justice Department started squeezing the freelancers. On December 3rd, U.S. Customs hit Jerry Patrick Hemming and 13 men training on Sombrero Key. Katzenbach asked J. Edgar Hoover if any of them had official cover. Hoover said no. The feds seized guns and filed Neutrality Act charges, then dropped them 6 weeks later. Hemming knew too many faces. He kept training shooters. By Christmas, FBI pressed CIA for a clean list of which exile groups were inside and which were out in the cold. Robert Kennedy, meanwhile, needed a win that didn't smell like Bay of Pigs. He revived the stalled prisoner exchange for Brigade 2506. James Donovan, the lawyer who traded Abel for Powers, had been shuttling to Havana all fall. Justice carved exceptions under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and drug companies got full retail tax deductions on donated medicine. Real money in an era of padded price books. On December 24, 1962, the prisoners came home. Kennedy met them in Palm Beach, and 5 days later promised at the Orange Bowl that their flag would fly in a free Havana. It was good theatre and sharper politics. RFK picked a horse, Manuel Artime, a brigade commander, not Miro Cardona. In January, he told Artime the money would come through a separate channel in Miami. It did. Artime got a secure line to a CIA officer, and by March, helped finding a base outside the U.S. He visited Luis Somoza in Nicaragua. Kennedy met Central American leaders in Costa Rica that month. The signals said, "Make room." The other comer was Manuel Rey, a former July 26th insider turned opponent. By February 1963, CIA admitted he had real backing from left-leaning Caribbean governments and from U.S. wallets. He raised union money in Venezuela, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, about $6,000 a month through a Caracas cutout, and told a CIA source his quickest path was to penetrate the militia and kill the top tier. The murder plots never really stopped. Paper later said otherwise. The logs didn't. Fitzgerald replaced Harvey, a top SAS, and by Deputy Sam Halpin's account, was just as committed to killing Castro. Harvey kept his end alive through Johnny Roselli. Over the holidays into early January '63, Harvey was in Miami meeting Roselli and Marcello, paying $2,700 for Tony Verona's 3 militiamen. He spoke with Roselli by phone mid-January. Both agreed the odds were lousy. In February, Harvey flew to Los Angeles. They agreed to wind the thing down slowly and keep contact with Verona to protect sources. He said he'd cleared one last Roselli sit-down with Helms. Someone tried anyway. In March '63, Cuban security grabbed a rooftop team near the University of Havana. The date circled was March 13th. Later versions tied them to Roselli through Miami channels. Years on, Roselli told Congress he never told the Cubans the job was cancelled. FBI surveillance had Harvey meeting him in Washington in June '63, long after Fitzgerald took Cuba. Another witness placed Roselli in Florida conspiracies that fall. Inside SAS, Fitzgerald wasn't acting like a man closing a file. Early that year, he ordered a workable assassination plan and told Halpin it came from on high. Ideas got weird. Poisoned wetsuits. Booby-trapped seashells. Maybe slipped to Castro through Donovan's prisoner swap access while Fidel was skin diving. In the shop, killing Castro was routine business, not a special request. Sabotage came back too, under the fig leaf of autonomous groups, Alpha 66, Commandos L, with lines kept deliberately blurry. JM Wave had lost formal control of Antonio Veciana in November 62 and suspected Eloy Gutierrez Menoyo of being a Castro plant. But the station kept marginal interest in both. They were useful. Autonomous groups could take credit for CIA work the White House didn't want to own. On March 18, 1963, Alpha 66 hit a Soviet target, and the administration had to show its hand. State disavowed. Kennedy publicly condemned unauthorized raids on April 11th. Inside, EXCOMM met 3 times at the end of March, and the split was obvious. McCone wanted the raids to continue. Robert Kennedy, for once, wanted a crackdown. Lyndon Johnson agreed. Kennedy worked the angles. Raids were loud and easier to sell than deep infiltrations, and the exile lobby liked action. He wanted CIA steering the raiders and, as Dean Rusk argued, aiming at Cuban, not Soviet, targets. The Bureau would hit freelancers and gun runners. CIA would corral what it could. Back in Miami, the DRE took the hint and kept 1 foot in and 1 foot out. They raised money in Chicago and Puerto Rico and started courting Texas moneymen. They bragged about meetings in Washington and said they'd fire their CIA handler if they felt like it. Langley responded with the Joanides switch and a tighter purse, but the students thought they could muscle the agency. It wasn't bravado. They had other suppliers, private anti-communists and mob intermediaries who liked cash business and no subpoenas. And threading through it all was Oswald, building a profile the camera could recognize. Leaflets, a sidewalk bust, a radio slot, a TV turn that somehow knew his Russian biography before he sat down. He took a trip to Mexico City to beg for a Cuban visa, another piece that, on the surface, screamed Castro groupie, and underneath fit too neatly with a different assignment. David Atlee Phillips, the CIA's information man in Mexico, later wrote and talked around a meeting with Oswald there, never straight, always sideways. The lesson plan he hinted at, shoot a leader from a high window during a motorcade, was the kind of detail you only put on paper when you're sure no one will ever see the draft. By mid-63, the board looked almost exactly like 61. Internal splits, rumors of uprisings, exiles testing boats, a standing order to have a plan. The difference was the president. After the missile crisis, Kennedy believed the uniformed side was wired to escalate, and the covert side was too used to lying to itself. He wanted options, but no trapdoors. Cuba stayed a hostage in his pocket for Berlin and a target if the island blew on its own. To the men in Miami and the operators who fed them gas money, which sounded like slow murder. To Langley, it meant improvisation and deniability. To Oswald, if he ever understood the script he'd been handed, it meant the part he was playing could be switched out overnight. The names on the memos changed. The mechanics didn't. The government kept 2 sets of books, one for treaties and speeches, one for raids and poison. The exile groups went where the money and the guns were. The mob intermediaries did what they always did, turning politics into logistics. And the young man with the handbills and the Russian wife kept walking into rooms where everybody else knew more than he did. Soviet troops were still on the island. John McCone wanted Castro out. Robert McNamara didn't argue. On April 3, 1963, the Kennedys told the CIA, turn the screws, maximum pressure. Sterling Cottrell's new Cuba committee came back with a menu: army training for exile infiltrators on US bases, balloon drops to blanket Cuba with leaflets, and sabotage of Cuban ships in foreign ports. McCone met Kennedy in Palm Beach on April 15th and boiled it down to 2 real choices: normalize relations and push the Soviets out, or push the Soviets out and topple Castro. Kennedy wanted both options ready. 10 days later, McCone put it in writing. Maritime sabotage might light the fuse for a coup, which, short of US troops, was the only plausible endgame. The president moved before the memos were dry. On April 19th, CIA cabled The Hague, greenlight Cuban shipping sabotage. On April 24th, cables went to European ports carrying a broader line, all feasible forms of pressure to generate disorder and collapse. Case officers were told to sell the pitch hard. If Cubans primed the conditions, the US would come. Into that mix stepped William Pawley, Miami tycoon, Cold War lifer, loud about regime change. He'd pitched Marines on a sugar plantation right after the Bay of Pigs and stormed out when JFK blamed US economic predation for fueling the revolution. He hated the missile crisis settlement and wanted Castro finished. In spring 1963, Pawley became the frontman for a new angle floated by John Martino and ghostwriter Nathan Whale, two ex-communists plugged into Senate Internal Security staffer Jay Sauerwein. The story, 3 Soviet technicians wanted to defect with photos proving underground missile sites still active in Cuba. Sauerwein dangled Senate testimony if CIA would extract them. Senator James Eastland rang Pawley, who smelled a chance to embarrass the White House and pry open the door to invasion. April 18th, Pawley went to Ted Shackley at JMWAVE, the CIA's Miami station. "Turn them over to the agency," Shackley said. Sauerwein demanded delivery to the Senate in 36 hours. Shackley refused. Pawley claimed he'd get General Marshall Carter's blessing and said Carter advised no paper. Shackley, who'd used Pawley before and didn't know HQ tracked him under the cryptonym QDDALE, agreed to let Pawley approach Martino, whom Shackley himself wrote off as an unsavory character. Pawley laid out a plan. Meet the Cuban pickup team on his yacht, Flying Tiger, guns aboard, with his own air cover. Whale erupted at the idea of letting CIA in. Pawley ignored him. Martino looped in Richard Billings of Life magazine, $2,500 a head for the technicians. CIA tried to kill the media angle. No dice. Shackley, Carter, and Desmond Fitzgerald, new head of the CIA's Cuba covert arm, swallowed it and allowed one life man aboard. There were no Soviet technicians. It was a rerun with different credits. Late '62, Loran Hall, one of Santo Traficante's old cellmates from Cuban jails, had reconnected with Jerry Patrick Hemming in Los Angeles. They took a Dallas-New Orleans tour through oil money, right-wing donors, and exile fixers, then headed to Miami. Hall said he'd run a couple of shipping raids in early '63 and picked up a bullet in the leg. Back in Dallas, conservative patrons funded a bigger play. Landmen in Cuba, behind a provisional government, rushed to the OAS and UN for recognition. In Miami, Hemming introduced Hall to Martino, who pitched something bigger than a raid and brought him to a hotel meet. Traficante stopped in to vouch for Hall. Then, Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli walked through the door. They put up about $15,000 for gear. Captain Bayo, a flamboyant exile veteran, took it. The real aim wasn't defectors. It was assassination. By late May, Pawley was spooked by Life's involvement. Shackley got him to cap it at Billings and called the odds 1,000 to 1, but let it run. Fitzgerald backed the call. On a June night, after a choreographed rendezvous off Florida, Pawley, Billings, and 2 CIA men watched a small boat shove off toward Cuba. Pawley later said he knew then it wasn't coming back. He was right. CIA paramilitary Rip Robertson did the post-mortem. Bayo and Martino had ignored exfiltration routes and recovery plans. They barely briefed their Cuban team. Martino acted bored. Days later, the Cuban Revolutionary Council, fronted again by Tony Verona, announced it had sent men in to invade. Manuel Artemes, MRR, checked names and found overlaps with Bayo's crew. Shackley concluded that Pawley, Sauerwein, and Life had been played and tried to salvage something for HQQDDALE, had renewed confidence in CIAs to run paramilitary infiltrations. The press had learned to stay out. And, on paper, 10 armed men had gotten in to irritate Castro, even if rolled up fast. Whether Bayo was working for Castro stays open. He'd tried a noisy defection gambit in '62 and now staged a fiasco that, if exposed, would burn Washington. Paoli took whatever he knew to the grave. In 1975, Shackley, testifying under the alias Halley, stuck to the cover story. Martino was trying to extract Soviet technicians. Easier than saying mob money financed a fake defector raid that morphed into another hit attempt. By mid-1963, Washington had revived regime change pressure without truly controlling the exiles, or the mob. And circling back into the picture was Lee Harvey Oswald. June 1962, the ex-Marine drifted home to Dallas, a city where Hall and Hemming had just found sponsors. May '63, he moved to New Orleans, a hub for exile operations and a town long farmed by Carlos Marcello's people. In June, he built a phony chapter of a pro-Castro group and promptly collided with the DRE's local arm. In Dallas, he'd befriended George de Mohrenschildt, a white Russian with business in the Caribbean who, like Hall, was dabbling in a scheme against Haiti. In September or early October, Oswald showed up at Sylvia Odio's door with Loran Hall and was sized up as a potential assassin, of Castro or of the president. Late September, he tried to reach Cuba through Mexico City, likely to put himself in position for a shot at Fidel. All the while, the Kennedys kept the pressure on. On April 3rd, they had demanded maximum covert action. By late April, they were authorizing sabotage in foreign ports and telling case officers to promise help if Cubans lit the fuse. The private machinery ran on the same fuel it always had: exile zeal, agency deniability, and mob logistics. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. Robert Kennedy was trading punches with organized crime and lecturing CIA operators to deliver results. But when the government got desperate, it reached for the same cutouts. During the 6-day sprint of the missile crisis, RFK had stormed into the Mongoose shop and dressed them down, without grasping how many of those assets were wired to Traficante's Tampa channels, Marcello's New Orleans network, and the Chicago crew around Giancana and Roselli. By summer '63, the official playbook said, pressure, sabotage, readiness. The unofficial one looked the same as '61. Freelance raids, bought boats, and cash couriers who didn't ask questions. Oswald, leaflets, radio, TV, Mexico moved along that same current, a low-rent actor in a production run by men who only played for keeps. And on November 22nd, he stepped from the edge of the web into its center, where all the threads, exiles, the agency, and the outfit's money, had been crossing for years. When John and Robert Kennedy entered the White House, they didn't just inherit a nation, they walked into a fortress. The guards at the gate weren't soldiers. They were men like J. Edgar Hoover, Henry Anslinger, and Allen Dulles, bureaucratic lifers who had been running Washington for decades. They didn't take orders from presidents. They outlasted them. Hoover had been at the FBI since the Harding administration, building dossiers on everyone with power. Anslinger ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics like a one-man crusade since the 1930s. Dulles turned the CIA into a shadow government, a machine that could change the map of the world without ever asking Congress. Eisenhower had warned Kennedy about the military-industrial complex, but he'd only given him the headline. The real danger wasn't just generals and defense contractors. It was how intelligence had become its own branch of government. The CIA wasn't collecting information anymore. It was creating it, manufacturing crises, building politicians, and turning American democracy into a controlled experiment. They had learned to seed their own kind across Washington: senators, congressmen, governors, men who looked independent but owed their rise to Langley's network of money and influence. The CIA's relationships with industry, banking, and organized crime blurred into one operation. Their goal was simple: control the machinery of government without ever appearing in the photo. By the early 1960s, the US had only two parties left standing, Democrats and Republicans, but it barely mattered. McCarthyism had burned the left to the ground. Socialism was a dirty word. Both parties were now fed by the same pipeline: corporate donors, Wall Street lawyers, oilmen, and defense contractors. The system was airtight. The ideology didn't matter, the money did. Kennedy saw it. He saw the same men, old, rigid, and unaccountable, recycling power between agencies, boardrooms, and think tanks. The same hands that built empires abroad were hollowing out the republic at home. Then came the Bay of Pigs. When the plan collapsed in blood and embarrassment, Kennedy realized what he was really dealing with. He'd inherited a CIA that operated like an unregulated army, a global Gestapo with better suits. If there wasn't a problem in the world, they'd go create one just to stay relevant. The invasion had been planned under Eisenhower and Nixon, fueled by mob money, exile groups, and covert funds. When it blew up, it was Kennedy who took the hit. The old guard watched him squirm. The agency men didn't forgive him, and he didn't forgive them. Kennedy forced Allen Dulles out and brought in John McCone, a businessman who thought he could broker peace between the White House and Langley. But McCone was out of his depth. He didn't understand that the CIA didn't answer to presidents. It answered to itself. Every new crisis exposed more rot. In January 1962, federal agents in New York seized a major heroin shipment, Corsican syndicates, Italian mob connections, and a money trail that ran straight through Southeast Asia. The pipeline stretched from Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, the same territories the CIA was using as staging grounds for anti-communist operations. The agency had taken the playbook of Paul Helliwell, the man who financed covert ops in China with drug money, and turned it global. The narcotics trade became a tool of foreign policy. Heroin profits funded black ops, and the same ships that carried arms to rebels carried opium back out. Behind the curtains stood bankers, shipping magnates, and intelligence officers who saw narcotics not as crime, but as currency. When Henry Anslinger finally stepped down, the last firewall fell. That left Hoover, who for decades had refused to admit organized crime even existed. Then came Joe Valachi, a low-level soldier who broke the code of silence. His 1962 confession blew the doors open. For the first time, America heard the words La Cosa Nostra. Valachi described a nationwide crime syndicate that had been operating since Prohibition, with its hands in everything from labor unions to Las Vegas. It made Hoover look like a fool. The FBI director, who'd spent decades chasing communists and deviants, now had to explain why he'd ignored the mafia sitting right under his nose. The Kennedys smelled blood. Robert, as Attorney General, went at the mob like a crusader, wiretaps, indictments, hearings. But the family's old connections to organized crime came back to haunt them. Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, the same men who'd once bankrolled Democratic campaigns, now watched in fury as Bobby tried to dismantle their empires. With the mob turning cold, the Kennedys pivoted. They went for the black vote. Civil rights became the next battleground. Kennedy reached out to Martin Luther King Jr., believing moral leadership could rebuild political strength. It worked politically, but it made him enemies that couldn't be policed. White supremacists, Dixiecrats, and John Birch Society hardliners seethed. They called Kennedy a traitor to his class, his color, his country. Add to that list the Cuban exiles who blamed him for the Bay of Pigs, the CIA officers he'd humiliated, and the mobsters he'd indicted, and you had the perfect storm. And Kennedy kept adding fuel. He deported Carlos Marcello, the mob boss of New Orleans, one of the most connected men in the American underworld. Then he authorized the assassination of Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican strongman and CIA ally turned liability. Months later, the Diem brothers in South Vietnam, Washington's puppets, were taken out in a coup that bore the agency's fingerprints. It was too much, too fast. In 2 years, Kennedy had crossed the intelligence establishment, the mob, the military, and the Southern political bloc, all while threatening to pull US troops out of Vietnam and dismantle the CIA's covert wings. To world leaders, he looked dangerous. To the power structure, he looked expendable. By late 1963, Kennedy's enemies weren't just whispering, they were converging. The CIA, the Cuban exiles, the mob, the military brass, and the right-wing underground all had one thing in common. They wanted the Kennedys gone. Robert was still swinging, but it was like punching in a dark room. He was hitting corruption, crime, and treachery at every level of government at once. He didn't realize how deep the roots ran. The Kennedy brothers had walked into a war they didn't even know was being fought. And the other side, the one Eisenhower had tried to warn them about, had already built a government of its own.